Hi, Andrew from SACS. Does your personality change as you age? Well, if you've known people who've aged, you may have made the observation that their personality might have changed. And of course, there's lots of research on this topic. Firstly, what do we mean by personality? There are two dominant models of personality in psychological research at the moment. The first is a thing called the 5-factor or Big Five model of personality. The second is the HEXACO model of personality, otherwise known as the Big Six. And this is a diagram of the HEXACO. H in HEXACO stands for honesty, humility. E stands for emotionality. X stands for extroversion. A stands for agreeableness. C stands for conscientiousness. O stands for openness to experience. And then there's this interstitial scale, altruism. Interstitial just means it didn't fit anywhere else, so it shares some of the variance from the other 6 factors. So it's not a 7th factor, it's what we call a facet or a sub-factor. Here's some research about what has been found in big studies into personality and age trends. And so this study was undertaken by Kibiam Lee and Mike Ashton, who discovered the HEXACO model of personality, and they identified a bunch of trends in about 100,000 people who were assessed in what I would call a low-stakes environment. What do I mean by a low-stakes environment? Well, fundamentally, people had a chance to complete a personality measure online, and so they weren't compelled to complete these measures. Hold that thought, though, because I'm going to come back to that. And what they discovered in this is that they discovered that honesty, humility increases with age. Honesty, humility is the tendency to be honest, truthful, rule-favouring, and not arrogant. Secondly, emotionality declines with age, beginning after age 30. So we become more emotionally stable as we age, less neurotic, if you want to put it that way. They also discovered that extroversion increases with age. People became more extroverted as they aged. Agreeableness declined slightly until aged 40 and then increased. So agreeableness is the tendency not to be angry. So a person who is agreeable tends to have a relatively long fuse, tends not to be cranky, tends not to be inflexible. Conscientiousness increases with age. So we become more organised, more hardworking, more diligent, and less prey to make decisions impulsively. Openness to experience increases overall until the late 60s and then declines. And really what we're saying there is that openness to experience is the degree to which people like new stuff. When people are high in openness to experience, they love new stuff. And finally, altruism, which increases to age 50 and then stabilises. Altruism is a characteristic of being soft-hearted and kind. Altruistic people often volunteer or donate money, for instance. Now, reading these articles caused me to identify data that we had, and we had data of 2 forms. We had low-stakes data. Low-stakes data is data that was gathered through research. People, once more, weren't compelled to complete this instrument. They were asked to contribute to a study where we would validate the measure of the HEXACO here in Australia. And we also had high-stakes data. And high-stakes data is recruitment data. This is where people were asked to complete these instruments, not out of choice, but they were compelled to do so as part of a job application process. 2 very different data gathering models. So what did we discover when we undertook this research? Firstly, let's talk about sample sizes. The sample sizes for low stakes, there were 1,758 people completed these instruments in a research environment, and the people who were compelled to do it was over 30,000 people. And in general, what we discovered was pretty similar to what Kibiam and Mike and other researchers around the world found. So honesty, humility, you see these correlations are positive. And what that means is that as one ages, you get higher in things like sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty. And in our high stakes data, this is where people were compelled to complete, we found a pretty similar thing. The second is emotionality. And so emotionality declined in Kibiam and Mike's data. And what we discovered here in the high stakes data, that definitely happened. Not so much in the low stakes data, but when we're talking about a sample of only 1,758, maybe that has something to do with it. Did we become more extroverted as we age? Well, largely. You'll see that the low stakes data supports this. All these correlations are positive apart from social boldness, which has declined. But in the high stakes data, you have kind of half and half. The strongest effect is a decline in sociability. So in this high stakes data, where people were compelled to complete, we found that people confessed to being less sociable. They liked to spend time less with other people and more by themselves as they aged. But the biggest difference was in the next 2 factors, agreeableness and conscientiousness. Now, Kibiam and Mike found that agreeableness increased in their samples, and in our low-stakes research-based data, you see about half and half. But in the high-stakes data, significant difference, where we got declines across the map here. So forgiveness, gentleness, flexibility, and patience all declined as people aged. So that implies that the people who had no choice in completing this questionnaire actually got crankier as they aged. In conscientiousness, what we discovered here is that people became much more conscientious in the low stakes data and much less conscientious in the high stakes data. Isn't that fascinating? When you don't actually have to fill in this questionnaire, then as you age, you become more conscientious. But where you do have to fill in the questionnaire, we found evidence that people's conscientiousness declines, which literally means that they become more lazy as they age. Now, that raises the absolutely fascinating question as to what's going on here. So we looked at a number of theories as to why this is happening. And theory number one is, well, it's the data gathering method. Maybe only conscientious and agreeable elders bother to fill in online surveys. Now, when you think of the data that's being captured, if a person is constrained, irrespective of their age, to fill in a personality questionnaire in the application of a job, you don't have a self-selection mechanism there. So what about if people who self-select to fill in one of these questionnaires online are naturally people who are more conscientious, easy to get along with, and in fact more like the research has previously indicated? So I wonder if data gathering could have a component. But there are some other theories. Faking of some sort. Do younger job applicants fake more assiduously? And so what that would mean is that, look, I'm young and I'm energetic and I'm going to paint a better picture of myself than my elderly colleagues. And not only that, there's a theory that older people strategically self-present. And what that means is maybe older people think, well, I don't want to look so callow and youthful and naive, so I'll be honest about this and I'll paint myself as being kind of more practical and pragmatic and maybe a bit lazier and maybe a bit crankier, because that's the kind of image that I want to present. A third theory is that it could be related to burnout and cynicism. So is the work world driving these people to be more cynical and lazier because they're burnt out from work-life experience? And of course, you might have some other theory. And if you do have some other theory, let me know yours. So does your personality change as you age? I'm going to show you one last slide. And this slide is what's called a multiple regression. And what we did is that we regressed age onto these personality characteristics. And what that allows you to do is to quantify the strength of relationship between age and these personality characteristics. Multiple regression is a really commonly used technique where you've got multiple pieces of data, and in a sample of over 30,000 people, it's a really valid thing to do. But what this shows you is that the relationship between age and personality changes is 0.16. And that means that about 16% of the changes in people's personality is attributable to aging. Now, what Kibiam Lee and Mike Ashton found, and all of the other researchers, was relationships that weren't perfectly linear, and multiple regression is a linear kind of a relationship. So if something goes up and goes down, then that's going to cause a lower result in a multiple regression. But in any event, 16% is not nothing, is it, when you think of my personality changing as I age? Fascinating data and really interesting theories as to why this might have happened. If this kind of content is of interest to you, then don't hesitate to like and subscribe.